Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Don't Pass Me By, Bob Wilson's show. But obviously, I'm not Bob Wilson. Tonight, I have the honor and privilege of serving as Bob's guest host. I am Jude Southerland Kessler, the author of the John Lennon series, which, if you don't know about it, which my line at every Beatles fest is, do you know about the book? Do you know about the book? It is a 9-volume series of books on the life of John Lennon and, of course, his mates, the Beatles, told to you in a historical narrative so that you feel as if you're actually there when John gets his first guitar or when he meets Paul McCartney the first time at the Wilton Garden Fete, or when they performed their last concert in Candlestick Park. There are about 4,000 footnotes in every book, so you're getting what actually happens, but it reads as if you're there, as if you're in a narrative or a play reading the story. So I am a John Lennon person. I am certainly not a Paul McCartney expert. So I feel very honored to be able to interview our special guest this evening, who is in fact quite savvy about Sir Paul McCartney. He is visiting us tonight from the Beatles kingdom, and he and his pal, Warren Brown, gave us that wonderful podcast that you all know and love, Tomorrow Never Knows. He has been a writer for Beatles magazine, and his shows with Warren Brown total over 250,000 listens. That is pretty dang impressive. Recently, in the last few months, he has released a brand new book with Don Jeffries, and the title is From Strawberry Fields to Abbey Road, a Billy Shears Story. That's an intriguing title. And if you've seen the artwork on the book, it's even more intriguing. So we are thrilled to welcome not only an author, a writer for various Beatles publications, and a podcaster, but my very dear friend, Bob Wilson. Bob, thank you for being on your own show.
Well, thank you, my friend. I was going to try and pass up on the gratuitous use of "Hey Jude," but hey, Jude.
Don't make it bad.
You always take any show and make it better, better, better.
Well, I love being here, and I'm excited to be able to talk to you about this book because it is really interesting. You have taken the Paul is Dead controversy that was with us from, approximately the mid-60s on to the end days of the Beatles. And you have let us look at it through the eyes of so many people who knew the Beatles well, people who toured with the Beatles, people who traveled with the Beatles, and people whose lives were affected by this controversy. So what was it about the Paul is Dead controversy that intrigued you and it influenced you to investigate and write this book, From Strawberry Fields to Abbey Road?
Would you like the good for promotion answer, or would you like the true answer?
The true answer. Well, give me both. Give me both.
Okay. I had a deep devotion to this subject. No, the real reason is because so many books have been put out about the Beatles that it's hard to find a niche that hasn't been covered before. So a minute ago you said there were 9 volumes. You have 9 volumes, right? Not me. My book is only 1 volume, right?
Right.
I'm just checking.
Right.
I wanted to make sure. I thought maybe I did more work than I thought. So I said, well, what could we do that hasn't really been done? So, there was some books on Paul is dead, and the people were saying he was really dead, and the books were kind of bizarre and creepy. So I said, we could say none of the books seem to say Paul is alive. So instead of trying to go through the rumors and, say that Paul is dead, I said, why don't we just say he's alive? But then what story is left? And then I thought, well, all these interesting people like yourself and Ivor Davis and our friends, Nicole Michael, they all said that they would be willing to be interviewed. So I said, they're all Beatle experts such as yourself, even though you like John better, but that's okay. But so I figured we'd let them tell their stories and how they remember this and what they think of it. So I said, in that, somewhere in there might be a book.
Yes. Well, it really is an interesting book because, I mean, you have some people who were quite close, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, to Paul. And if anybody would know whether he's dead or alive, certainly they would. And you have people who are not close to him at all, but for whom this story really impressed them and impacted their lives. And one that we're really not going to talk about tonight, but that I found extremely interesting, was the fact that Bob Hope's secretary chimed in, and she talked about her memories of the Paul is dead controversy. That was a very interesting person to invite to be part of the book. How did you get to know her?
Well, the book is published on Bear Manor Publishing.
Uh-huh.
So my friend Ben Omar runs Bear Manor Publishing. So sometimes I look through the catalog, and since we're close friends, I'll write reviews for him, and then he'll give me the books for free. So that's my motivation. So I went and looked on Bear Manor for what was new, and he said, lo and behold, there's a book by Bob Hope's secretary. So I said, now that's the kind of person I would like to talk to. So I wrote to Ben, and he wrote back and put me in touch with her. And then I found out she had all these Bob Hope stories, but the most incredible one was how she got her job. Do you want to know how she got her job, Jude?
I'd love to know that.
She found this out after she was on the job. She got hired as Bob Hope's secretary, and she went for a walk around the grounds one time, and she was surrounded by these vicious, horrible, Omen-like, Gregory Peck movie dogs. And the handyman rescued her from these vicious dogs. So then she found out from the other people that she worked with that she got a job because the last secretary had been attacked by the dogs and fairly torn up. And Bob was very rich. I think he was worth $120 million. Oh my goodness. And he didn't even want to pay her medical bills. So that was how the job opened. And then it ended up in negotiation. He had to fork over some money. So he paid for her medical bills, and then she got a souvenir stand in somewhere like Bermuda to sell, live in Bermuda and sell T-shirts and seashells by the seashore and such. So that was how we got her into the book. Wow. That was how I met her. And I said, how would you like to be? And do you like the Beatles? And she did like the Beatles. So then she was happy to be in the book. So because I wanted to talk to her again, I had interviewed her. We kind of stretched things as I usually do, and we made a segue to get her into the book. Is that a good answer, or should I?
No, that's great. And I thought what she had to say was really interesting, but even more interesting than what she had to say was your conversation with one of the Ramones, as it were. Tell us about your connection with them.
Well, I grew up in Queens, New York, and some people pick that up instantly by my accent. And the Ramones were from Queens, New York, so they were from the same stomping grounds. So, they grew up right there in the neighborhood. They still lived in the neighborhood. So the Ramones were like a presence. So we would go to see the Ramones and such. And early on, my big excitement was I went to a show and I got to hang out for a while with Johnny Ramone of the Ramones. And he took a poster for me, and he got all the bandmates to sign it. And then during the show, he threw a guitar pick. Is that what they call it? They threw a guitar pick at me, or to me. I don't know if he threw it at me. And I got to meet Johnny, but he's since passed on. But Vera Ramone has written her own book about the Ramones. She was married to Dee Dee Ramone, the bass player, and she was from the neighborhood. So when I said, would you like to be in the book? She said, if you only ask me once and stop bothering me, send the questions. And then she was in the Gabba Gabba book.
That is...
I kid. She didn't really say that. She's a sweetheart. She said right away that she would be in the book. Oh. And she was very helpful. And she, like you, I don't really edit anything, you might have noticed. I have somebody look it over sometimes. But she's also a meticulous editor and very bright. And she did a good job talking about how much the Ramones were influenced by the Beatles. And
Yeah.
and how the Beatles shows were so short. You must know more about that than I, but they would play half an hour shows or so.
Uh-huh.
And the Ramones would say, like, if the Beatles only played a half an hour, that they only had to play a half an hour. So they would play kind of short shows. And they got their name from Paul Ramon. You know that story.
Oh, yeah.
So that
Yeah.
was Paul's nom de plume early on. So
That's
so they were like buddies. And then I know Vera has met at least Paul. And so she's a big Beatle fan too. And she went to see them, I believe, over at Shea Stadium,
wow.
stomping ground of the Mets.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, you have one person in your book that is a must-have get to be able to talk about the Paul is dead controversy. And I was hoping that you would be able to entice him to join in the book, because according to this individual, he just might have been the person who started it all. And very few people get to talk to Fred Laborde. So tell everybody who he is and how you got in touch with him. And then share a little bit. You have to say all of it because we want people to buy the book. But give us a little idea of what he said in your book.
Well, Jude, it happened like this. I was looking through some mishmash of articles and things like that, and I noticed Fred's name kept coming up. And he actually won a Grammy Award later in cowboy music. He's very talented. Ghost Riders in the Sky is the name of his band. They're Grammy winners. But I didn't know he was a Grammy winner yet. I thought he was just some schlub like myself. So I figured he was approachable. So I looked up Fred's management, and I wrote to them trying to get in touch with Fred. And I think I looked up his Facebook page and wrote to Fred. I didn't hear back from Fred, so I thought he was a wise old soul who knew to avoid this. But I kept at it. I tried again. And just as the book was going to press, as they say, I gave up on getting Fred. I said, if we could get this guy, it's sort of, aside from yourself and people like Ivor, this validates the book. I haven't seen Fred interviewed too many times. So just before the book had to be finished, I said a prayer. And lo and behold, all of a sudden I got an email from Fred Laborde, and he said, I'll be in your book. So I couldn't believe my good fortune. And then Fred told us a story that he just made the whole thing up as a lark. It was a joke. He had been driving in Michigan and late at night, and he just thought of, instead of writing a record review, he'd make up this story about the clues, which I think had some foundation already, but it hadn't really taken off. But he made up, a ton of the clues came from him. And he wrote about it, and the local newspaper actually sold out every edition because he had put this story in it. So it took off, in a life of its own. This is before the internet. So that's pretty incredible. And now we say it hits the internet, it goes aflame. But this was just newspapers, and it took off. So it's pretty incredible the story spread without the use of the internet. And he's very gracious about it. And he said, he said he hoped he never offended. That was never his intention. And he never thought anyone would really believe it. He was just kind of goofing around, making up the album cover, album cover clues and reading into them. And I think, the walrus one might have been his, I believe. You think I should know that since I wrote the book, but my memory slips these days. And anyway, he said he just made the whole thing up. And here we are today. And then he has a Grammy, and he's also a bass player. So thank you, Fred. I sent my prayer out, and all of a sudden the wall I couldn't get through brought me Fred. So thank you, God.
That is amazing. He was a college student when he did that, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was at one of the schools in Michigan. I could narrow it down for you if I had a better memory, but he was on the college newspaper too. But I think that ended up in the local edition of the regular paper, and it sold out every copy as such. He was like, a reviewer of the records. They'd put out Sgt. Pepper. Then Fred would tell you what he thought about Sgt. Pepper. And he thought that was getting kind of old, so instead of just doing the regular review, he made up this hijinks, and here we are today. He gave me the fodder to get my name on a book cover. Who would have thunk it?
Well, he got in touch with a mutual friend of ours, Lena Stagg, when she was doing her Rock Blocks radio show, and for sure. But anyway, he came on her show, and I listened to him, and I thought, oh, I wish you could get him for your book. And so thank goodness you said a prayer about it, and he was able to join you, because what he has to say is super interesting. And he totally got something huge started, didn't he?
It's with the internet, you could think so, like things get so big so quick, but just with the newspapers and, radio in those days, and I think they had televisions too. There were little boxes in those days. It's amazing that that took on such a life of its own. And I was surprised on Facebook, there's still pages where people allege that they really think he's dead, or at least they make believe they think that. And they take it very, very seriously.
Oh, very. I was very blessed to be on George Nuri's program, Coast to Coast, about 2 years ago, when the recent volume of the John Lennon series came out. And we talked for about an hour about things that happened in that particular book in 1965. And then he said, well, before you go, I have to ask you, what do you think about the Paul is dead controversy? And I said, I know nothing about it. I am not a Paul McCartney expert. I have no clue. And he said, so you're not going to weigh in one way or the other? I mean, you're not going to weigh in whether you think Paul is dead or not? And I said, I totally don't know. I really don't want to say. I just think it would be very extreme or difficult to find someone who looked just like Paul, sang just like Paul, was left-handed, played the bass guitar as well as he does, and wrote songs and composed exactly the way that would be very, very difficult. And oh my goodness, I got such bad email just from saying that. So you are so right when you say this is a very hot topic. And you talked to three people that I think could weigh in very heavily on the Paul is dead controversy. And the first one, tell us a little bit about him, is Laurence Juber.
Well, Jude. Laurence Juber is a big shot. He played with Wings when Paul got arrested, and he almost didn't die, but he almost ended up in the pokey in Japan forever. If he wasn't like Sir Paul McCartney, I don't think he was yet, but if he didn't have like people on his side pulling for him to go, he might have been in jail. But Laurence, they were getting ready for that tour, the big tour of Japan, when that happened. But nonetheless, I digress. Laurence Juber is our friend Brooke Halpin once said to me, Bob, do you know the most impressive musician you've ever interviewed? And I said, you mean besides yourself, of course? And he said, of course. You know Brooke. And then Brooke said, I said, I'd be guessing. So he said, Laurence Juber is the best guitarist, classically trained. He's extremely talented, and he's a musician's musician. So for some reason, I wrote to Laurence Juber, and he answered me. It's a shock in itself. And he actually came on our podcast from his home studio, and he played like a 5 or 6 song concert for us, which was pretty incredible. But I asked him about the Paul is dead controversy, because that's what the book's about. What was I going to ask him? And he made a joke of it, and he kidded around about it. But and he of course thinks Paul's alive, and Paul signed his paycheck. So, but he was he made there's some good jokes in the book that I can't remember, but that's good, because then you'd have to buy it to read the jokes.
I mean,
so leave it at that.
This guy that played with Wings, and if he doesn't know, then who would know? My Laurence Juber story is when Volume 2 of the John Lennon series came out, I was having a book signing in New Hope, Pennsylvania. It's a quaint little town on the Delaware River, and I'm on the street with Richard Langham, who was second engineer in EMI for the making of the Please Please Me LP and From Me to You on the 5th of March. And we're sitting there signing books, and this good-looking guy walks up.
Were they your books, or were you just signing books because you like to cause mayhem?
Just at random. No, it was Volume 2, Shimmering Inside. And I'm selling and signing my books. And this good-looking guy comes up, and I said, hello. I said, do you know about the books? And he kind of picks one up and shakes his head. And I said, well, they're the life story of John Lennon. And this book took place in 1963 when the Beatles made Please Please Me. And they made From Me to You. And he goes, wait. Stop right there. I know about this. I'm Laurence Juber. I could have.
Whoa.
Talk about being embarrassed.
Okay, then.
I was a little bit embarrassed. I should have
So did he pay for a book or did he get a free book?
I gave him a free one.
There you go.
Of course. But he would know. Okay, the next person that you talk to.
I keep trying to guess who you're going to go to. And okay. I know eventually it's going to be Ivor Davis. So you keep throwing me a curveball. But, Laurence Juber's actual first name isn't Lawrence. Do you know what his actual first name is?
Let me think about this. Paul.
Ivor.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah, it's his real first name, Ivor.
Well, then let's segue right into Ivor Davis. You talked with Ivor Davis. Who in the world is the great Ivor Davis?
Ivor Davis traveled with the Beatles. Ivor Davis hails from England, and he came over to the United States working for one of their daily newspapers. And they sent him on an assignment to cover at that time which might have later seemed like the Bay City Rollers, and they told him, you're going on tour with these four lads and you're going to travel across America with them and go to all their concerts, be in the limousines, play Monopoly with them, and hang out with them after the shows. As soon as you hear Long Tall Sally, that's the name of his bride who's departed from us, but he still holds dear to his heart. Ever soon as he heard Long Tall Sally, he was told to head for the limousine or they'd leave him long tall behind. So he traveled with them day in and day out, as you know better than I. And I have to text before I call. You can just call Ivor. And he was there for everything, playing Monopoly with John and going to all the shows and seeing everything up close and firsthand and personal. And he's also written some other books too, which usually for some reason wind up being about serial killers like Charles Manson, but that's another matter.
That's funny. Well, he certainly knew Paul quite well. I mean, he's on the plane, the Electra 2, flying everywhere in 1964 with them for almost 2 months. And then again in 1965, he's with them when they go to San Diego to perform and almost got killed because the bus broke down and they were at the mercy of the fans. Thank goodness they got a limo to pick them up. And then he's with them at the Hollywood Bowl, and he's with them. He's one of 2 people that get to be with them the night that they meet Elvis. If anybody would know who Paul McCartney is and is not, it's Ivor Davis. So how did he weigh in, Bob? Did he have an opinion?
He made a joke of it. I knew he did. He's reticent of the subject because Apple Records seems to be very touchy about the Paul is dead rumors. So Ivor has been a great friend such as yourself, and he's promoted all my stuff despite the risks to his own reputation. But he nonetheless wanted to help. So my first question to him was, is it true that you were at a cocktail party and Ringo turned to you and said it really was hard on John writing all those songs after Paul died? So Ivor made up an answer that was quite humorous that you'd have to purchase a copy of the book for to hear the retort to. But he played along, and he kind of made a joke of it. He doesn't think Paul is dead. He said it's the same Paul who he was on tour with back in the day, who he met in one of Paul's more recent tours, where I think the tickets weigh in at a wheelbarrow full of money to get one seat. He had a drink with him, I think, in Beverly Hills at a bar somewhere, which is a good place to get a drink, a bar. But he hung out with him. He said it's definitely the same Paul, so there's nothing to that rubbish. But he was very nervous about being in the book. But he doesn't want to say no because he's such an avuncular, jolly gentleman. And he said to me, Robert, they do get quite upset about these rumors, and they, if I say this, he was very nervous, but he still agreed to do it. I said, I'm not going to actually say he's dead, Ivor. So Ivor was relieved, and then he came along, and he was a real sport about it, much as yourself. He would have been here tonight, but he has a new work coming out, and I think he wants to distance himself from his appearance in my book before it's released.
Well, I do.
And who can blame him?
I want to say for our listening audience that get ready to get a copy of Ivor's new book, because he has taken his most excellent work, The Beatles and Me on Tour, about his time with them in 1964, 1965. And he is, by the way, the only journalist to tour with the Beatles from day one to day end on that 64 tour. Other people hopped on and off. He was the only one with them the entire time, and the ghostwriter for George Harrison's Daily Express column. He has taken that and he has enhanced his first book The Beatles and Me on Tour with new information, new photos, and it is going to be an incredible book, and it's coming out in 2024, the early part of 2024. So be looking for that because it's going to happen soon.
Be looking for that. I'll have my binoculars out, but I'm not going to buy a copy. I'm going to see if I can get one from him because we're close personal friends.
I'm sure. I feel certain that you will. Certainly.
But if he made me pay for it, I would buy it. If I was going to buy a book, I would buy yours or his. I'd have to toss a coin.
Well, you'll never have to buy one. So you're like Flynn.
And I probably wouldn't because let's face it, I'm cheap.
Even though Errol Flynn wouldn't like me using that phrase because he never cared for it. But all right, the next person, and if this guy doesn't know the truth, no one does, because only your hairdresser knows for sure. Tell us about Leslie Cavendish.
How did we end up with Leslie Cavendish on the show? You know, it's funny. I used to have a memory for everything. I'd remember these things from when I was 3 years old. I remember being in the crib and my mother didn't believe me and I described things to her and she said, my God, he does remember these things. But we did shows I didn't even remember. We were doing some, for that when we hit our stride with Warren Brown. I mean, of course, cover to this book and it really gave it an identity. He did a great job with it. But we had people on and like there was no affront. I didn't want to mention the person so it looked like I slighted him, but I asked somebody to be on the show. I hadn't realized they'd been on already, so that might speak to me. But we just had done so many shows. We were fortunate. And then Leslie Cavendish came up through somebody, and then I contacted him, and he's a real gentleman. He answered right away, and he had great stories, like going over to Paul's house to cut his hair, and Paul was like, playing like Eleanor Rigby for him or something for the first time, and he cut all the hairs, and he didn't just cut one of the hairs, he cut all of the hairs. But he had he also had a tie-in, I think, to Jay Sebring, so it was just weird connections and such. But he had such interesting stories, and he knew them up close and personal. So he was an incredible find for the book that I just kind of stumbled upon.
So his book is The Cutting Edge. And I was fortunate to have Leslie on the podcast that I do with Lena Stagg called She Said, and he is so charming and he is such a super nice guy. He talked about the way that he got to actually cut Paul's hair. He said that one day when he was working at a top hairstylist at the Vidal Sassoon salon in London, Jane Asher came in and she could not get her usual stylist, and so they asked Leslie if he would cut her hair, and he was very nervous about it and very, oh my goodness, it's Jane Asher. And then she liked what he did so much, she said, could you come around and cut my boyfriend's hair as well? So he did, and they got to be great friends. And so what was his take on the Paul is dead rumor?
Well, I mean, he, being a man about town and a famous guy, what was it over there in, London in those swinging days? What do they call it? Soho or whatever? He was a man about town, and he's, sophisticated, and he knew all these people, and he's very intelligent. So, he knew that Paul was alive, but, his take was, I guess, just, telling some anecdotes about having known them personally, and it was the same hair he cut in those days. And much, just, I guess to him, the thing that struck him was the magnitude of the rumor, which is really what I think strikes most of us, as you had brought up before. How did this spread? In the days before the internet, how did this take off like that? That it's still with us today,
right?
And it's people still argue about it. It's kind of amazing. So his take on it, I guess, was to tell us some anecdotes from the side, some of the ones you had just related, and he did a great job of that, and then just weighed in, basically with what you were saying. Nobody could really take this stuff personally.
Right.
No, they could take it personally. Paul takes it personally. Apple takes it personally. They couldn't take it seriously, is what they couldn't take.
Exactly. Well,
I'm all over the place tonight. Rein me in.
You talked to a lot of people like this who were primary sources. They knew Paul, they traveled with Paul, they were co-workers. And then I really like that you went to another level and you talked to people that probably weren't mates with Paul, but they were performers and entertainers traveling in the same world that he traveled in. So tell us a little bit about Bob Cowsill and what his take was on the Paul is dead controversy.
The Cowsills were brought in by my co-author Don Jeffries. He had a link to them, and the Cowsills hit their stride. They still have quite a fan base today. They still play together, the remaining Cowsill, and have a podcast out there. But I guess much the same as he was taken, a huge Beatles fan, and I guess looking up to the Beatles. Like the Cowsills were good musicians, but of course the Beatles are like Beethoven roll over. But it's like they're like the Mozart of rock and roll. The writing of Lennon and McCartney is kind of untouchable. I think aside from their charisma and good looks, that's what kind of gave them everything they're based on are the songs those guys wrote. They're good musicians and they have very good voices, but I mean, the songs are what everything stood on. So I think he just looked at, the Beatles as a step above his stuff, which I'm not putting down. They had some really good songs and some songs that last with us, but I think he looked at their musicianship, and I don't think he believed the rumors, but as they bandied about, they were young enough, I think, to take it a little more seriously than some of the crowd like Leslie, who was an established gentleman, a man about town, or a man like Ivor, who was an established intellectual. See that, Ivor? I called you an intellectual. And,
Yes.
I think the Cowsills were young enough maybe to wonder about it for a little while, but I know he doesn't believe that anything happened to Sir Paul.
Right.
Paul is Live, as his live album is called.
I actually know Susan Cowsill. She's performed many times at Enoch's Irish Pub in Monroe, Louisiana, my so-called hometown of the last few years, and lovely group of people. She's very affable, just easy to talk to, super person. So what about Susan Olson?
Susan Olson. Well, there's a Brady Bunch connection that strangely goes through this book that's a mystery tour unto itself. Susan Olson, of course, was on the Brady Bunch, and she's been a controversial podcaster and such since, and a radio personality since. And Laurence Juber, our second Ivor, there was a second Paul, there was a second Ivor, married Sherwood Schwartz's daughter from the Brady Bunch. So it's funny that his wife, who's been on the podcast Tomorrow Never Knows with me and Warren, there's a Brady Bunch connection there that's fired through the book, which we didn't, intentionally go out of our way to do. But here's the story of a girl named Susan. She also is friends with Don Jeffries, and he asked her to be in the book, and she said yes immediately. And she came in and weighed in on it and talked about the different clues and that it was interesting. And she told us, I think she was in a couple of Elvis movies when she was young. And she related those stories too, which I found fascinating, being a fan of Elvis. And she was a good sport, and she looked at it, with intelligence, and talked about the rumors, thinking that perhaps some of these were intentionally put on the covers for some publicity. And I know it's like somebody like who's really smart, like Bruce Spizer, says like, there was nothing to it. It was all, spontaneous. And I think some of it, of course, was like Fred LeBour looked into those rumors, and he, made something of it. But I think after it took, a life of its own on, I think some of the clues the Beatles put on were actually put on intentionally. Like I've spun my record backwards in the day, and it really does, Turn Me On, Dead Man is actually on there. It's not cranberry sauce, which is a different clue. I'm confusing my clues, but the different clues, but it really does say Turn Me On, Dead Man. I find that very hard to be a coincidence.
Yeah.
And who's the first person to find that? That's very bizarre. Like, who was the first person to play the entire Revolution 9 backwards to hear Turn Me On, Dead Man, which is kind of
really, who says, hey, I know what we should do. Let's play this backwards. Really? That's what all you have to do this afternoon? And
I asked Bruce, I wanted to know how that happened. So I didn't ask Bruce Halpin. I'm a mess tonight. I asked Brooke Halpin how do they do that? Because he's like a Grammy-winning musician, and he would put up with me sometimes and talk to me, even off shows. And I asked him, how do you like put something like that on a record? And I totally didn't understand his explanation, but he's an inch. I just wanted to mention Brooke again. He's always been a sport.
Well, I will say this. And
Apropos of nothing, Brooke Halpin has always been a sport. Hello, Brooke.
I love it. Okay, I would never contradict the great Bruce Spizer, but let me add a twist, if I may, on what Bruce said.
A twist of Lennon or a twist of Spizer?
Oh, definitely a twist of Lennon.
Okay.
If the Beatles' personalities are consistent with their personalities in Hamburg in 1960, which I think they were always the same people, they just got older. When they are kicked out of the Indra and they are going to the Kaiserkeller, they're being promoted to the Kaiserkeller, they're standing on the street.
Sounds scary, being promoted to the Kaiserkeller.
Well,
sorry, I digress. I'm sorry.
They're waiting for the van to move them to the Kaiserkeller, and they have their equipment with them. And they said, let's don't just say we got promoted to the Kaiserkeller. We need a good story. And one of them says, hey, we'll say that the Nin, N-I-N, the little old lady who lives above the Indra, called the police and had us ejected for noise, which sounds like a fun little story, except for the fact that the only little old lady who lived above the Indra was deaf. So they were known for making up some things for fun. And why not embellish the story, and make it a little better, take a sad song and make it better. So, they might have had something to do with the later clues. Here's a clue for you all. The walrus is Paul,
Well, I mean, he couldn't have put that in the song. Like he had, like just what you mentioned, he had to be well aware the rumors were going on.
Exactly.
So I think they did tweak it a bit. That's my take on it.
That's my twist of Lennon. All right, Mitch Weissman. I have to admit, I was not that familiar with Mitch prior to your book. So tell us a bit about Mitch.
Well, geez. Mention my late mom again. When I was 10, Beatlemania, the Broadway show, had just started in Manhattan on Broadway. I think that's where Manhattan is. And I liked the Beatles since I was 5. My mom wanted me to go try on clothes at Sears, and I refused. And she said she'd buy me a Beatle record if I'd try the clothes on in a little fashion show, and let her find out what I needed to wear if I went to Sears. So it all started then. And then by the time I was 10, 5 years later, I was an avid Beatleaholic, or whatever you want to call it, Beatlemaniac. And that was on Broadway. So my mom went and bought tickets, and somehow my mom ended up with first row tickets, which speaks of how good she was to her children. Oh. And I ended up in the first row at Beatlemania, and who was playing Paul McCartney but Mitch Weissman? And they have like the stage. They're not supposed to look out at the audience, but I was peeking behind the curtain in the first row, and I saw Mitch Weissman, and I waved to him. And being on stage, he darted back because they're not supposed to be seen. And so that's what he started. He started in Beatlemania. He was a big deal, and he was on a lot of TV shows in those days. He was on a lot of talk shows promoting everything. He really looked like Paul. Yeah. Spitting image and a talented musician. In his own right, he's written songs with Kiss. And he's a real sport. And one thing that sticks in my mind, so my mom sent me to see them at 10, and I always, of course, would want to meet them. That memory stuck in my mind being that age, it was so exciting. It was like seeing the Beatles, which is why they call it Beatlemania. Yeah. So anyway, all those years later, I had contacted Mitch and said, would you come on a podcast? And he came on. So it was kind of like hearkening back to when I was 10 and getting to, tell him the story of when I waved to him. And he was really cool. And then I said to him, do you know how in She Loves You, and you guys go, whoo. So he, of course, knew. And I said, just this once, would you do that with me? I'll be George and you be Paul. And we'll do that. So he did the woo with me on a podcast. So that's forever immortalized. And he also is so cool that I think he actually took a couple of my phone calls later just to talk. But he's a really nice guy, and he still writes songs with Paul Stanley of Kiss. And he's really cool. And,
Go ahead.
Well, so he's still, like, when I do things, any little project that comes up, he's always willing to be a part of it, and he's a good sport. And he's a really talented musician in his own right, and just cool, And he talked about how he met Kiss, and they were rehearsing for Beatlemania in some studios in New York, and Kiss was in the next sound room. And he said what huge fans they were, and they came in and sat with them for like 3 hours and listened to all the Beatles songs, and made requests that they would play. And that's how he became friends with the guys in Kiss. And of course, through that, he met some of the Beatles. I think he met Paul, and who else is in the Beatles, Jude? I think he might have met George in the day when George was still with us and such. But I can't speak. Out of all the different people you meet of note, he's been one of the cooler people. And if I call him up, he doesn't say like, "Why'd you call me?" Message me first. He's just, "Hey Bob, how are you?" So I really like Mitch Weissman.
Now, so I'm guessing that he probably believes that Paul is very much alive.
Yeah, and I mean, if anybody could, look how close Mitch Weissman is to Paul McCartney. Geez, they're both handsome fellas. He looks like Paul. They have the same kind of eyes. He sings like Paul. He can even play the bass left-handed, and he really couldn't trick us if he was in person trying to play, could he? So if even Mitch Weissman couldn't make believe make believe he's the real Paul McCartney, who could? So the whole thing, yeah, he believes Paul is well and with us.
Yes, I did.
Did I digress? Did I run around in too many circles?
No, that's great. That is great. So,
but I really like Mitch. He's a really nice guy.
He sounds like a really nice guy, and that kind of blows my whole theory out of the water that I was talking about on Coast to Coast. Like, how could there be someone that looks so much like him, plays guitar, can write, can sing, yada yada? I guess that if George Noory had thought about it, he could have said, "Well, there's Mitch Weissman."
But even Mitch couldn't pull it off. You know what I'm saying? Like Mitch, when they darken the theater and put stage lighting on and makeup, he does as good of a job as you could, but people would still know if they bought tickets to see Paul, they'd know it wasn't Paul as good as Mitch is. Right. So an intelligent person such as yourself makes an excellent point when you said what you said. But even he couldn't pull it off, even with, right. Unless they made a film maybe with AI technology, but they really couldn't pull it off in the theater.
Yeah. Well, okay. So first you talk to primary sources, then you talk to fellow performers and
water this down, please. I'm a kid from Queens.
And then
my primary source.
And then you
my primary sources.
Some of the leading Beatles music experts in.
Well, you were there.
Oh, no. I'm talking about the man hailing from NOLA, the man who has written, I believe, 13 books now about the Beatles, maybe 14, Mr. Bruce Spizer. What did Bruce have to say about the Paul is dead controversy?
Bruce is a good sport, and Bruce puts up with me, but Bruce does not think the rumors were, he doesn't think any of the rumors were like made up on purpose. He thinks it was all a coincidence. And he's much smarter than me, but I beg to differ on that one. But, he knows the clues inside and out. He can describe them to you off the top of his head. That's impressive just the way he can do that. But, I just think with some of the things like Turn Me On Dead Man and, some of the others, that didn't get on the record by accident. And as Don Jeffries has pointed out, the Sgt. Pepper cover looks like a grave. And it's kind of weird with the left-handed guitar and, what does it say on the thing? Welcome the Rolling Stones. Right. I don't think all those things just got there by accident. And then you turn the record over and Paul's backwards. It's like they were playing. To me, it was, what do they say? They're having a lark.
Having a lark. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Well, then you go to the big guy too. And Bruce is the big guy of all Beatles music experts. He is the encyclopedia. But you went to the Rock and Roll Detective and you asked him what he thought about it, Jim Berkenstadt. So what did
when Jim started out, he was very humble. And he would talk to me like, "Hey, it's Bob. Hey, Bob, what's up?" And he still does. He is still very humble. But now he's, my God, look who he's become. He's worked with like the Traveling Wilburys, I think, had him do work for him, and the Harrison estate and John's estate, and he's done all these different things that my good friend has become so I'm afraid to approach him. He like hangs out with Roy Orbison's son. All this, of course, I mean in jest, and you know, I'm so happy for his success. But boy, is he taken off since the first great book on Jimmy Nicol, which was a wonderful book in and of itself. He, you know, of course, he also doesn't shock us by saying Paul is dead. I should say that just for a joke. I should say Jim Berkenstadt thinks that Paul is dead. No, he doesn't. He thinks he's alive, but you know, and he's a rock and roll detective, so he would know because he's on the case. But you know, same things. He thinks the clues were out there and people made a go of it, and it took off because of the, you know, level of popularity. The Beatles were like four of the most popular people on the planet, and it took off, and that's the way Jim. It's like Jim's a rock and roll detective, but he never finds a conspiracy that he likes. He always puts them to bed. And I brought a couple of controversial ones up in private, and he's like, "I don't want to go there," and he hangs up.
He does not like things you can't substantiate.
He's not going to tell you who shot Kennedy, but God knows he knows his Beatles, and God, he's become one of the. He's up there with the likes of you and the heights of Beatle writerdom.
He's a sweet, sweet guy. I got a text from him this morning saying, "Do you have a copy of the Lennon Letters by Hunter Davies? Because I've been reading it thoroughly, and it has a lot of information that you could use." I mean, it takes time to send me that. Very sweet. Jim, for those of you that don't know, the rock and roll detective, wrote a book called Black Market Beatles about all of the bootlegs, and he has an amazing collection. He really knows his bootlegs. And then he wrote a book called The Beatle Who Vanished, the story of Jimmy Nicol, who played with the Beatles for 13 days during the world tour of 1964.
Which basically ruined the rest of his life.
It did. It absolutely 100%.
Poor Jimmy Nicol.
Yeah. And Jimmy Nicol vanished. I mean, he was seen in Mexico for a while, and he was here, there, and everywhere. But Jim sussed him out. And I won't tell you the end of the book or where Jimmy Nicol is today. But Berkenstadt does his research. And he has an award-winning book called Mysteries in the Music, which came out about a year and a half ago. And so if you want the answer to rock and roll mysteries, he knows. So if he's telling us it might not be true, I would put a lot of faith in what Jim.
Well, he's like a big shot lawyer before he's been an author, so he knows his stuff. He's a highly intelligent fellow, and he certainly knows his rock and roll too.
He does. He definitely does. And now a gentleman that hails from Scousland, from Liverpool. Also a person who knows his Beatles. He's written the book Liverpool. He's written The Country of Liverpool, about the country influence, country music influence on Beatles music, and the Fab 104, about all the people that influenced the Beatles. David Bedford, he chimed in as well, didn't he?
I can't say enough about David Bedford. In all seriousness, I try to joke a lot anyway. I don't know if I pull it off, but he's a wonderful human being. He spoke to me and gave an interview on the subject, but he also went out of his way, much as yourself. He'd had a good event happen in his life, and a man of faith, man with a good heart. And he wrote to me and said, "Something good happened to me, so I wanted to do a good thing for someone else." And he said, "I picked you." So he went and he published an article about From Strawberry Fields to Abbey Road, touting the book and only saying nice things about it. And he did that out of the kindness of his heart, which you do as well. I expect you to do that because I know you, and you're always doing kind things, you and your family. But David, you know, from across the pond, we used to correspond and email. But he went out of his way to promote the book in a big way, and he didn't have to do that. And I didn't even nag him. He just, maybe I did a little, but he went out of his way to do that on his own. He's quite a guy.
He is quite a guy, and I want him to come back to the Fest for Beatles fans. He hasn't been there in about a year, and we miss him. He's such a man of faith, and he stands up for what he believes, and we all love David Bedford. He is my Scouse brother, so really miss him. Well, we're just naming just some, and I mean a top of the
Well,
ice
you
hockey.
know, I got the if I can if I can interject with one.
Sure.
We didn't mention one guy who I should have when you brought up the Ramones. But you know, Ramon wasn't their real last name, of course. But Joey Ramone's last name was, you know, his brother's name is Mickey Lee, and Mickey Lee grew up where I grew up in Queens. And they said, you know, I knew people who knew him because I grew up in Queens. So I said, you know, could you drop him a note or something at this restaurant they go to, different things. And everybody said he'll never give an interview. He doesn't give interviews. And then I used to write things they published in the Daily News in a sports column that the sports writer would publish these silly things I wrote about sports. And they knew me as Bob from Richmond Hill. And I wrote to Mickey Lee and I said, hey, it's Bob from Richmond Hill from the old Mike Lupica news, you know, Daily News column. Is there a chance you'd be in this book I'm writing about the Beatles? And I dropped Vera Ramone's name, just saying, you know, she's in it. And everybody said, he's never going to do it. He's never going to do it. And he wrote back and he's like, I'd love to be in that. Then he called me and we talked on the phone for a really long time. And he said he's excited about being in it. And, you know, he's a musician in his own right. And his brother was Joey Ramone. So all the Ramones people were really kind to me in coming out. And because I grew up in their neighborhood, you know, it's like if you grew up near the Cavern Club, so to speak.
Yeah. You're Jimmy
Um,
from the block.
and so he came in the book and he told some great stories. And he also told me some, you know, not, you know, some stories about, you know, growing up and in the music and being in the neighborhood. So Mickey Lee was a cool guy. He's a huge Beatles fan. And it meant a lot to me. It's like if you grew up by the Cavern Club and, you know, the Beatles were right in your neighborhood. So the Ramones were right there. And, you know, they dressed very, you know, dressed down sort of in their jeans and, you know, in their T-shirts and sneakers. So they were quite approachable. And I'm a huge Ramones fan, as you can tell. So
Yeah.
having him in the book was like a feather in my cap, and having Vera in there was, you know, also a feather in my cap. Like it was just so much fun, you know.
Well, you
In this,
totally guessed what I was going to ask you, because what I was going to say is did anybody that agreed to be part of the book shock you, or someone that you never imagined you'd get to talk to? Was there anyone else that you got to speak with that you never thought you'd get to talk to?
yeah, there was one person who blew me away. It was another Bam Manor Media story. I was looking through their catalog as I'm wont to do, and Ben Omar has some great, you know, books on entertainment in there, old entertainment, you know, old Hollywood and music. And I really like he does stuff other people won't publish, you know, and should. It's really great stuff. So you know, I'm a tremendous Gregory Peck fan. So when I was a kid, um, you know, I hated school, but I would take the train into Manhattan and go to the Strand bookstore and buy books Gregory Peck movies had been based on. So, you know, you had books like Spellbound by Hitchcock was based on a book, and Gregory Peck was in it with Ingrid Bergman, right? And was that her name? And you know, other books. Like I'd run down and buy the used books and find these paperbacks, and I'd read the books his movies were based on, and I'd watch all the movies as a teenager. I was really taking each movie had a theme that was really deep. It asked a question about life. They weren't just throwaway movies. Like, you know, kind of Bob Dylan songs that like each one, even the ones that were kind of lesser in the catalog, each one means something, or the same with John and Paul. So I'm looking through the Van Manor catalog and I see this guy, Joe Brutzman. So I figure he's just, you know, he's just a guy who likes Gregory Peck. So I said, hey, Ben, can you get him on a podcast with me? And Ben said, sure. So Joe Brutzman comes on, and I think I'm just talking to another guy who is a Gregory Peck fan. So we go through this whole interview. He's a fascinating guy. He's very intelligent. And then he said to me, do you want me to come on next time with my friend? So I was like, you know, having him back would be a gas. We get to talk about the Gregory Peck movies and stuff. And I'm like, yeah. So I didn't know his friend was Gregory Peck's son. So he brought Gregory Peck's son onto the podcast twice, which I never in a million years expected. And then I approached Joe, and I just you know said, you know, after Gregory Peck's son came on, he paid me one of the greatest compliments of my life, and that it was over, the show was over, and I talked about Dylan's connection to Gregory Peck, and he told a story he never told in public before. I don't know what this has to do with Paul is dead, but I'm the king of digression. So he said Dylan could pick whoever he wanted to give him his Kennedy Lifetime Achievement Award, and he picked his father, Gregory Peck. So he told the background story of how Gregory Peck was rehearsing the speech he gave, to introduce Bob Dylan into the Kennedy Center. So that really moved me. So then when the show ended, I just figured let the guy go. He came on. This was cool. That's that. And he goes to me, Bob. And I was like, wow, he's still talking. The show's over. Usually hang up, he'll be gone. And he said, the three of us, meaning Mr. Brutzman, who went to Juilliard, by the way, I found out later. It was a really talented fellow in his own right. He said, the three of us have to talk about my dad again, even if it's not on a podcast. So I was never so shaken as having Gregory Peck's son pay such a compliment, but he did come back on the show. But he said, even if you don't want us on the show again, I was like, are you kidding me? So I asked him, about the Paul is dead rumors, and he talked about what a fan he was of the Beatles, and that he was out of the country because his dad was filming a movie, I think, when the Beatles were at the Hollywood Bowl, but you'd know better than me who played where when. And he said when he got home, he wished he could have gone to see them there. And he talked about all the records and such. And he was a big Beatles fan, and he talked about his dad. So I never thought I'd be having a casual conversation with Gregory Peck's son. I still wake up and I think that that's going to have been a dream.
I'd like to interject that I heard both of those podcasts. And
you were the one.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of people. It was, and I want to recommend it to everyone listening to this. I'm not a great, I was not a great Gregory Peck fan. My life was very much taken up from the time that I was 9 years old until this very moment with John Lennon. So that was pretty much all I did. And after I listened to this podcast, I started watching Gregory Peck movies and really getting into it. This conversation with Tony Peck and is it Joe Brutzman? Joe, right?
Yes.
And Bob is magnificent. So where can they find that, Bob, to listen to those two shows? Was it done under the auspices of Don't Pass Me By, or where can they hear that?
Yeah, if you go on Podbean, it's on the Don't Pass Me By shows. And I also saved, he came on a different show too. I used to be on the Acelli network, and Chuck Acelli gave me the tape to it, so I have it, but they also were on the Podbean. So, yeah, I'll never forget that one. I know you've interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of Lennon people. So, nobody can compare to what you've done. I think in terms of John Lennon, and I know when you're on a show, we pay compliments and stuff, of course, because we want to, bring out the good side of people. But with you, it's not stretched in any way. I mean, the amount of people that you've interviewed from A to Z on John is amazing. But, for me, just like that one interview, it was like stop the world. I never thought that I would ever get, I might get to say hello to him or something, but I never thought I would get to speak to his son, and his son was moved, if I can digress even further, in that I took a chance. They said Greg didn't answer his fan mail anymore. So I used to write to people and who he worked with and ask him to sign pictures, like, Angie Dickinson or different people who had been in his movie. So I'd send a picture of them with him that I bought at this old movie store in Manhattan. What does this have to do with Paul is dead? I don't know. Ask Wiser Minds tonight. But so I sent to these people. And he asked me to tell a story because Brutzman had told it to him, Mr. Brutzman. And I had written Angie Dickinson, and I wrote a really heartfelt, long 3 or 4 page letter about, they were in Captain Newman, MD, and the Sinatra crowd, and, what it meant, to me for all the work that they'd done and how great she was working with Greg. And they'd been personal friends. So I gave up on getting a response after about 6 months. And then all of a sudden I came home and I got my mail and I was on the run, Band on the Run. I was Bob on the Run. So I ripped open the envelope and I saw, wow, the picture's signed, but it seemed to have 2 signatures. But I didn't have time to read it. So I ran out to do my errands and I came back and there was a note inside and it said, I read your letter and was touched, and I saved the picture until I saw Greg love Angie. and the picture was signed, in the day they called me Bobby. So it was signed by Angie Dickinson, and then it said, for Bobby, Gregory Peck. So
Wow.
she saved the picture until she saw Greg, and then he actually wrote me a little. Aside from that, he sent me a letter on his stationery. I guess he knew what that would mean to me. So his son was touched by that story.
Wow. I
But
hope
he
you
still thinks Paul is dead. So
I hope you
not
have
dead. He thinks he's not dead. I don't want to start.
hope you have that framed.
I have it in plastic in my closet somewhere, but I'm gonna have it mounted someday.
Beautiful. Wow. Okay. Where can people get your book, and where can they follow you on social media?
Social media. We're gonna start a new podcast. Tomorrow Never Knows officially ended. We're waiting see if Warren Brown can do him again after he valiantly battled back from not feeling too well. We have the Don't Pass Me By is up, but I think we're gonna try to get a new podcast going. But and in the midst of the Beatles book, I thought perhaps that would be, it came out and I was happy to be published. Unlike you have like one for each finger and toe. You have a book out. But I was happy that Bear Manor said, would you want to do another book? So I picked Elvis Presley this time, so I won't give more away on it, basically, because I haven't figured out what I want to say exactly. But so we got that coming out. So those are the only things on the back burner at the moment. But I also get to talk to my friends who I met from all this, like yourself and Ivor Davis. And after all this time has gone by, I think the Beatles are fun and writing is fun and all this stuff has been fun. But the real trick in this and the real fun in this has been making the friends who also are such nice people like yourself who become friends, and it actually supersedes any fandom to any group or anything else or the music. It's been more fun talking to the people and their experiences and about what they've done and the books they've written or the music they've made. That's been the real kick for me.
And you are definitely on Facebook, aren't you?
Yes. I keep my friends list low at 69 or 70, but I am technically on there. But the Tomorrow Never Knows Beatles Kingdom page is up by Warren, and that still has daily posts on the Beatles and has some of the shows we've done and his great artwork. Without his artwork, I think, without introduction to the show like that with the graphics and such he's done, that was, a piece of work in its own right. He's very talented, and he's still at it.
He is. We think both of us think the world of Warren, and we're glad to see that he's doing better and feeling better. And hopefully you'll have a new podcast soon, because the two of you are a great combo, a great team. The book's for sale on Amazon, right?
Oh, you asked me about the book and I answered a completely different question.
No, I asked
the book is up on Amazon, From Strawberry Fields to Abbey Road, a Billy Shears Story. And I had to give Warren credit because I didn't want to say anything about Paul is Dead on the cover because of Ivor's warnings that wouldn't be good. So I was actually Warren Brown who said, why don't you call it a Billy Shears Story? So that was his idea, and I thought that fit perfectly.
It did. And the artwork is so well done. Warren is really talented. I think people will enjoy the book from beginning to end. There's so many people we did not get to touch upon this evening. So get the book, read it, enjoy it. You're going to hear from people that you don't expect. And they all did a great job of talking about this controversy that really kept us all intrigued through the late 1960s. So, Bob, thank you for being on the show tonight. Thank you for letting me guest host.
Letting you? How could we not have? That was a blessing.
Well,
but, thank you, girl, as the Beatles would sing.
Well, it's been great, and I hope to see everyone listening in February the 9th through the 11th at the Fest for Beatles fans at the TWA Hotel in where the Beatles landed 60 years ago. And it's going to actually start on the 9th, which 60 years ago on the 9th of February, they were on the Ed Sullivan Show. So what an emotional and fun weekend that's going to be at the Fest for Beatles fans. And who knows, Bob, maybe you'll show up too.
Stranger things. Maybe I'll come with Mitch Weissman if he's not busy. So the topic for this show when it's filed is when Bob met Gregory Peck's son.
And many other things as well. Okay, well, Thank you. Thank you so much. And we will be talking to you very soon. And to everyone out there, we know that Now and Then has just been released, and perhaps it is Paul McCartney singing, and perhaps it is Billy Shears. Only time will tell.